What's going on, everybody? I am here with three people that I think are pretty smart people as far as dealing with the construction side of stuff when it comes to, is it safe or fair to say all ex-Mormons, post-Mormons, sorta, kind of, whatever?
Yeah, we
Traditional ex-Mormons.
Yeah. So from the very start of my whole channel, I've just been kind of on the critical end of stuff too. Marty's pointed out from the start that we're all just kind of stuck in this level of criticism, and not like this isn't sort of its own version of criticism, but we decided to review John Vervaeke's most recent releases of his After Socrates series. And I think his After Socrates series, you guys can correct me if you think it's any different, but I think he's attempting to kind of create a type of possible secular religion where all Western ideas can come together and unify in the same place a little bit under the same ideas and the same thinking and the same who knows what, to try to create like a type of more unifying place amidst our meaning crisis. Because one of the big things that he kind of goes on about saying is that we have a meaning crisis in the West with all the deconstruction going on. Anything to add to that? No.
For free on YouTube.
For free on YouTube. Yeah, no price. So to introduce you guys, everybody knows Marty. Marty's been on the channel before. Christopher has been on the channel from before the Crow's Nest, but I haven't put it up yet because I lost the episode and now I found the episode. But I think it's pretty evergreen because when StreamYard updated it, I had like three episodes that kind of got poofed and I thought they were gone, and then I found them. But I think it can still come up. And Christopher's been on Marty's channel. Seth, have you two met Seth before?
No.
I met Seth at a circle.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, Marty and I, we did the Jordan Peterson discussion.
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, that was fun.
I wanted to make that one, but I didn't.
Yeah. So Seth has his channel, Transcendent Philosophy. Actually, I can maybe pull these up. These are little bits I might edit just to show the channels. Here's Seth's channel, and you have a website as well, right? Called the same thing. You can find him on Facebook and.
Yeah, I got a link tree. I got lots of little places where I'm putting stuff out there.
One of the things I like a ton about Seth's stuff is he makes things visual that are kind of like ideas or things that are hard to comprehend. He's far more thorough than I am when covering philosophy, so he'll cover all the stuff really detailed and give all the little lines and contingencies and stuff of each philosophy when he covers them. It's really good stuff. And then we know Marty's channel here, and Marty got to interview
John Vervaeke, right?
The man we were talking about. Yeah, Marty with Where Will You Go over with Bill Reels. What's that whole network called?
Mormon Discussions.
Yeah.
With an S or without an S, I'm not sure.
And she got to interview John Vervaeke, and that's
almost
awesome.
a year ago. I can't believe that. I remember.
Is it a year ago?
7 months.
Oh my gosh. I could swear that was like 3 months ago.
That was one of my first episodes. Like it was episode 4, and I can't read. But
I watched it right when it came out. I swear that was 3 months ago. I'm losing track of time so hard. And then we got Christopher, and I've gone over Christopher's stuff, and I'm going to release the episode. And so we haven't gone over it yet, even though I did go over it, and I'll get that mixed up in my head before the Crow's Nest. And he's got a bunch of interesting. His stuff's really kind of would you say most of your stuff is written like you script it before you write it and put it up? And
yeah, well, the first two specifically, I'm changing that with the one I just started a couple weeks ago. I'm instead of just kind of reading it like a book, I'm giving more commentary because the world kind of people want more commentary instead of bland stuff for that kind of topic.
So he's got a book as well called The Quantum More, and so all of us get into philosophy in one way or another, but it's all different areas, and then that's how philosophy is going to be, because it's a million miles wide, right? But the Quantum More gets really deep into some stuff and kind of pulls from a lot of the different ideas of postmodernists and all that stuff. But something about all three of these, and why I asked them to do this and gave them the big fat amount of homework, although I don't feel that bad about it because it's Vervaeke that you get to listen to, but it's still a lot of time, and you guys went through it and did it, is that these guys are all doing the good work of doing construction stuff, post-Mormonism, rather than just doing the deconstruction stuff. That's how I would describe it. And Vervaeke, coming into this, I just wanted to ask you guys, what did you? I mean, Marty's been a fan and interviewed with Vervaeke, and I know that you followed him all the way down, but still want to ask you, what was your impression coming into this of what it was or what you knew about Vervaeke before the
Me first.
yeah.
So it's interesting because when I interviewed Vervaeke, the reason I reached out to him is because of that episode he did with Jordan Peterson and the Four Horsemen of Meaning. And there was a line in there where he talked about how he was ex-Christian and he was describing how I felt. And I was like, this isn't something Jordan Peterson talks about ever.
Yeah.
And so I reached out to him without really knowing much about what he was doing. So I wish I would have done more homework. I tried to, but anyways,
Before you reached out to him?
well, before I actually got to interview him, yeah.
Oh, really?
Because I think by the time the interview came about, I had gotten through a bunch of the episodes of The Meaning Crisis, and I recognized that I liked it, and I feel the meaning crisis, right? And so I didn't have a problem with it. But as far as this new venture, I still have like this skeptical part of myself that's like, it feels like he's not trying to be a guru or a grifter, but there's that voice that I can't shake. So there's that skepticism that's still there. So.
I promise you, with the four of us, it's going to be impossible for that not to be the angle for it to come from. And that's, I want to come into this with trying to do the buy-in and trying to do the this is one of the first times in all philosophy, because usually I read almost all philosophy kind of with a skeptical eye, but I'm going to try to buy in. I'm going to try to think like you're asking us to think. I'm going to try, but you get four ex-Mormons and so, or post-Mormons. I don't know how you guys like it described or whatever, but it's just going to be that way. But that's part of what I wanted to review about it. Is like, can we get past that or no? Right. You know, let's go round the clock. Let's go over to Christopher.
What was the question exactly again?
What you knew of Vervaeke, or what was coming into it? What was how much did you know about Vervaeke, or even Plato or Socrates and stuff?
Yeah, well, I mean, I am Greek, and so I just heard about that stuff all growing up. My family's from Trikala, Greece. Pretty, just like one grandpa back, really. So I heard about this kind of stuff all my life, whether or not philosophically angled, because Mormonism. I found the meaning crisis. How long ago was the meaning crisis? Like 3 years ago?
Yeah, I'd put it around there.
I probably found it a year after it was uploaded and went through all of it. I didn't necessarily personally find it like helpful or meaningful, as some would say, but I mean, generally informative for people in our realm. And I think the thing that I noticed first difference from the meaning crisis to this one is like general conference tone.
It's just the tone of the talk.
Yeah, it's very much like you're sitting in general conference and there's a timbre, a rhythm, whatever, all cadence. That. Yeah, cadence, pentameter, whatever you want to say. And it feels a lot more. And he says in the first video, he intends it to become like a wisdom spirituality, which is just another word for online church. This is just Paul Vanderklay, except for John Vervaeke.
Yeah.
So those were some of my thoughts going into it, and then initial impression with some of the things he said.
I think he's fully kind of intending and purposefully trying to do that. But I mean, maybe we'll get into that more. Let's hear what Seth knew or thought about coming into it.
Yeah, so I think I got introduced to John Vervaeke kind of tangentially through Jordan Peterson. I went through a phase of kind of going through Jordan Peterson's work, and then I started to explore into John Vervaeke a little bit. I just kind of, getting my toes wet. Kind of my impression is that Jordan Peterson, he kind of zooms down into kind of like the super practical side of psychology. It's like, this is like, I'm telling you what to do. Like, here's the rules. He's kind of like the superficial applied ethics side. John Vervaeke, he seems kind of like deeper. Like he takes it a step back to like this meta level, but it can be a little bit harder to relate to because he's not really, just giving you the answers. So.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that's one of the criticism of it, because I think he means this to be. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I swear he was saying this before going into it, if you followed it all, that he meant for this to be something that like a layman could pick up on right here. Like if you didn't completely follow his prior series or any sort of thing like that, like maybe anybody could pick up right here. But as it goes along, to me, it seems like you have to come into it with a lot of prior knowledge. That's what I think.
Yeah.
So maybe I was wrong. Was I wrong? Did he not say that? I mean, I can't remember.
He said that it was there were like pros and cons either way, whether to go into it assuming had people seen the meaning crisis or had they not, and he decided to go into it saying that they had, I believe is what he said. And that for those that hadn't, along the way, as you've seen, he references his Plato's Cave video and others that he just recommends for like catch up. I think that's what he said his approach was. So it's a mixture of maybe most who know John Vervaeke are coming in, they knew the meaning crisis, they have a base of the language. People who are finding him now, maybe he intends it to be simple enough to pick up on, and that'll just depend on the person. I don't really think so.
Yeah. So I tried to imagine like what would it be actually coming into a Christian church or a Mormon church first time, like really with zero outside context or knowing what it's like do they stop and hold your hand at all to get you going, or is it we're just gonna start flowing with this and assume there's some prior knowledge about Christ and the Bible and stuff like that? And that's what this feels a little bit like to me with Socrates and Plato, which I guess the next question is like how much Plato do you know? I mean, I think everybody, especially in any philosophy, Plato's been floating around, and I don't think anybody doesn't get a little bit of Plato somewhere. But there's all different levels of it, because I think you could even have like a whole career in philosophy, but never have really kind of gotten all the way back into let's get through all the Plato stuff. Do you guys have a lot of prior experience with Plato? Or
I'll go first again. So I have gleaned it from other places, right? Like I think Plato's around and you learn it. But that's one thing that I thought was interesting in that first episode. He's like, hey, read these books. And I'm like, I probably really should do that because I just don't know a lot about Socrates or Plato. But I know a little bit, right? But anyway, Wikipedia page is helpful.
Yeah. And Christopher, you said you grew up all around it, but that could be just like you grow up all around. I remember when I was in the MTC for Mormonism, that I was shocked at some of the stuff that was in I got bored and sick of church when I was a kid. But then I got in the MTC and we learned all this stuff about the Book of Mormon. I was like, what? It just had never really come up in all the years of kind of church and stuff like that. And it could be the same with Plato. Like you hear all these other things a million times, but then some other things are like, where'd this come from? I had no idea this was all in there, but I don't know how much of this kind of sparked off as new to you. Or
not very. It's hard to say. Most of what I got of that kind of stuff growing up was a lot from my own reading and just sprinkled in things from my grandpa, and going through his journals, literature, family things, and mixing it just with school. I think Socrates was more of a prevalent name, but I think I obviously learned much of that via Plato and never really realized it. And then going out of Mormonism at all, I just came across it all again, and it was a nice refresher. I think it was Jonathan Haidt maybe that got me interested in Plato again.
Nice.
Yeah, just kind of a general across my life. So it wasn't. It's not terribly new knowledge for me. If anything, it's the same knowledge with a different vocabulary that I've had.
That's one of the things you bring up all the time
for it now, and he's just adding a third. So. Yeah.
But what's the difference in the vocabulary? I'm curious.
Well, nothing. That's the difference is the vocabulary. It's just words. He's mentioning concepts like landscape salience, I think is one, or salience landscaping, whichever way it is. And that's not anything philosophically new or inventive or whatever the word would be. It's just his...
Like the phenomenology of noticing the ground that you have to walk on or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially the same thing as Taoism's field. I mean, that is Tao. Salient landscaping. I can't remember quite how he defines it, but if I remember right, it's essentially Tao. That's the field that you have to focus into.
And one of the threads in a lot of your videos and a lot of your ideas are always the same word, same thing, different words, you know.
Yeah, same game, different name.
Yeah, that's your thing. Yeah, that's the word. And Seth, Plato, like how much was Plato?
Yeah, so I kind of like, my approach to studying philosophy is to speed run the history of philosophy. I'm not trying to get bogged down, you know.
Me too.
So like a lot of the high level concepts I'm kind of familiar with, you know, the Plato's forms, and I've gone through some audiobooks of, you know, the Socratic dialogue, so I'm kind of familiar with, you know, the dialectical style of conversation that Socrates engages in.
Yeah. So for me, my whole life, I mean, poking around philosophical stuff, and I have stopped and like read at one point the Republic, or stopped and read the Symposium at one point, and then listened to Will Durant talk about it, or all these different people who categorize and talk about different philosophies. But it was all spackled in, and like Marty said a million times, so many different philosophers are bouncing off of Plato and Socrates, which, I mean, I guess if nobody knows listening, or just to give context, everything we know about Socrates comes through Plato. So that's I'm kind of mashing them together there. You'd come across this little concept that, you know, Leotard's going to go off on this concept, and you go, what's this concept again? And so you look up the Plato concept, and that sort of thing I've done 15 million times. You know, like, let's stop and remember this little concept that this other guy's going on and on about. And maybe it's kind of a good thing, and I think this is one of his intentions, is stopping and saying like, hey, let's all go back to the roots and see what everybody's, let's really get familiar with what everybody's kind of bouncing off of. And this has kind of come up a lot over in some debates over with Jacob Hansen, the Hansen brothers, is that I've been talking with them that so much of Plato and what later became Neoplatonism got interwoven and unwoven and interwoven and woven so many times into different religious traditions that have been around us our whole lives, so much so that you could say that it's also there in Mormonism and all that stuff. Like Vervaeke says, it's ultimately becomes the spiritual grammar of the West, you know. And I think it's, at one level or not, it's part of the flavoring of all the stuff, or how we view idealism. And it's definitely there in a lot of the different other philosophies, like sometimes in inverted ways. Like, a lot of people will point and say Hegel's like an inversion of it. But a lot of the ideas behind Plato are that the ideal and the peak of the ideal is kind of like a pyramid. And if you really get into it, you kind of realize that Peterson's been talking about and talking this way all along. And a lot of people kind of didn't realize he was talking that way all along. Does that make sense? I think he was like kind of like smuggling it in a little bit, and people didn't exactly understand. Not everybody understood that all the way through. But
here's the difference with Peterson. He likes to fall back and say like the Christian, I don't know, I'm trying to remember. Before he was sick, he would say things like, the Christian, we're not reviving the foundation that our society's built on. And he would be talking about Christianity. And that's one of the questions I had for Vervaeke, is it's like, well, if Christianity is based on these, like Plato and the ideas from the earlier philosophers, then shouldn't we be saying that that's what we need to say? Like, why Christianity? But anyways.
Yeah, and I think if you go all the way back to like Aquinas, who did it with Catholicism, or Maimonides, who did it with the Jews, or I can never say his name right, Avicenna, or it's Avicenna with Islam. There's all these different people who kind of started blending in the Platonism into that religion, and then before long, they were saying both at the same time. Does that make sense? And they were mixing in this talk of like the peak ideal with their also kind of literalism at the same time. To me, it almost kind of seems like it's pretty frequent of a late stage version of the religion, of like, okay, let's start rescuing it because the literal part is getting tough. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And it's happened so many different times through history, and some religious things, like Jonathan Pageau's Eastern Orthodox. If you listen to Eastern Orthodox and how they talk about God, it's almost, you might as well be talking Platonism, you know. And they do mix things, like Vervaeke hasn't gotten into it yet, but in Neoplatonism they have this thing called the One, which is basically God, and then they have the nous and the logos, and all those things get translated like one to one, like the logos is Christ and that sort of thing, you know. And
yeah, Chris, I want to follow up that point because just to further emphasize, like I totally agree with you. I didn't realize it until you started talking to me about it, because Jordan Peterson, he always equates the value at the top of the pyramid with God. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And after you talked about Neoplatonism with me, I was like, oh yeah, he is smuggling it in.
Yeah, 100%. And if you go back to that first interview Peterson and Vervaeke had, I almost kind of think like it feels like he's talking with a guy who knew what he was doing. You know what I mean? So you can see Peterson's kind of like that was kind of like, hey, what's going on? You know, it's like it was a little bit like he'd been caught out by the guy who knew what was happening, if that makes sense. And
but to Marty's point, I find it strange, like you said, why doesn't Jordan Peterson look to philosophy as the deeper foundation that needs to be rescued? Because I've seen Jordan Peterson talk about how science could not exist without Christianity, whereas that seems backwards. It seems like philosophy is the truer foundation.
Yeah, that epistemology of the stuff. Yeah, that sort of blurring describes the past 2,000 years better than you know, just saying it's been one or the other. There's always been kind of like a blurring of that going on in the West. And that's another thing I wanted to, Seth and Christopher, you guys know more about Eastern stuff than I do. Eastern's like a complete, not complete blind spot, because I've done the Wikipedia level reading of stuff, you know what I mean? But, and I know that you guys noticed that Vervaeke, he does some Taoism and Buddhism and adds that in, right? A little bit. And I don't know how much you picked up on that or not. And,
I mean, I already said kind of a lot, because there's a lot of it that's just a different script for the same thing that Taoism offers, I guess you'd say. And he says that, you know, Taoism has no method, which is more or less correct, but a little incorrect. And some of the things and we might just have to come across some clips for me to really get at what I'm noticing. But I think there's some very stark examples where, and I don't know exactly how he's trying to bring Taoism into it. And I've actually tried to ask him, and I haven't gotten a response. Like, which transliteration, rendition does he prefer? Has he used the most? Because that would tell me something. I've read like 13 different translations, however you want to say it. And I have 3 favorites. And I think depending on which one you're using might lead to certain language or approaches, methods or non-methods. And so, like I said, to really organize my thoughts on what he may be missing that's really anti-Taoistic when he says it is Taoistic, I might just need to like hear some clips or some things that you pull up. But there's a lot of that in there that I notice. I don't know about Seth and what he knows about it.
Yeah, I think, like, if I'm remembering this correctly, I think he's trying to bring in like the idea of the Tao and the idea of the dialectic and try to kind of like mix these ideas together. And it sounds like a kind of an interesting approach, because, you know, like the Taoist yin yang is like the opposites, that they share something and they're kind of merging and coming together in this harmony. And so I think there's some potential with, like, you know, trying to like bring those concepts together.
Yeah, I agree there too.
so Marty sent me a couple clips. We can go over the clips, and then I've also got Seth's outline, and we can maybe like just read through the outline and see which things we want to pull up or look up, and then call it that. From the start, I jokingly said before I said we were going to review it, I made this joke pulling from Dewey Cox show, where his wife says to him, like, I believe in you, Dewey, but I just know that you're going to fail. And what I was putting in that is kind of the same way I think Nietzsche's idea through Thus Spoke Zarathustra kind of failed to create a new whole Christianity. You know what I mean? I think like all the ideas or all the stuff, everything could be great and good and totally understand it. But I think it's a tall order to get big group, cohesive, unified, like to get the big following. You know what I mean? And that's I sometimes joke about Joseph Smith. Like, did he pull gold plates out of his hat? Well, he pulled a whole following religion out of his hat. That seems like the tougher deal sometimes, you know what I mean? But
sorry, that was a point I always made to ex-Mormons, is he didn't just write the Book of Mormon. He wrote a whole religion. And that's more impressive than just having done the Book of Mormon. So think on that for a minute. And if Vervaeke's maybe trying to do something similar, he's got some work ahead of him.
Yeah. So it's just like, that's always the question, because I think there's no problem with like any individual, atheist or whatever, just easily say I can make a morality. I only think it's hard to say I can make a group morality. Like I can get a group buy-in on on one thing or another, and I'm rooting for them to do a good. I'm rooting for something like Vervaeke here, or somebody else, or whoever can do it. You know what I mean? But always double-edged sword stuff. Let's listen to this one.
Could you understand other people's sages such that you could enter into dialogos with them? You don't have to agree with them. They don't have to agree with you. You don't have to come to a conclusion if Socrates is right. But if Socrates is right, that would still be part of the best, maybe the best kind of life we could live with each other.
So that's me right there. So yeah. I noticed.
And I love that too, because like one of my issues why I think something like John DeLynne's Thrive is tough is that it's not really welcoming. It claims to be welcoming, but it's not really welcoming of still active Mormons, right? Whereas this sort of framework could be welcoming of a Catholic or an active Mormon or an atheist or a whatever, But can you do it, or does it work?
Right.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think it's he kind of he's setting it up with a really flexible approach where it's kind of like pick a sage, like make the sage the ideal that you kind of move towards as your goal. You know what I mean? It's kind of flexible.
And that's, I don't know, that's where I get rubbed wrong, because one of the things I learned from Taoism is Lao Tzu's not a sage. It's a moniker for a group of people over hundreds of years that compiled the Tao Te Ching. There was no Lao Tzu, so why should I choose him if I feel that Taoism has the way? And one of the lessons to Taoism is don't look to anyone. And maybe that's not so much Taoism as the Zen I've brought into Taoism.
Well, leading up to this, he was talking about that you should, I can't remember the word for it, but several sages. And if you have a favorite sage, he's just saying you don't have to if it's Jesus for you, you can keep Jesus, but this will help you in your Jesus worship.
Yeah, I think the whole thing is trying to keep people on board who have other sages more than saying like get a new sage.
That makes sense. Alan Watts say get a new sage.
That sounds like
would say something.
That's a great little hashtag. Get a new sage.
Let's see. Marty's got a second clip here.
Now you may be saying, well, I'm not going to get into any fights. I hope that's right, by the way. Because if you fight, even if you win, you lose a little piece of your soul. So
yeah, let's break that down a little bit. What does he mean by soul?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's soul in Plato and Socrates, and that's one of the things I've kind of been a little bit on a bit, is that the buy-in to the Plato stuff automatically kind of buys into this framework that is like a deism. I don't know how else to put it. Although I don't think Vervaeke personally believes in the soul that way.
Yeah, I don't
definitely
think so.
Not.
But
well, if he's being honest in some of his other interviews.
Yeah, but it does presuppose that kind of deistic world.
But I think one of the things that he does, and he's not going to get into this because that gets too inside baseball. If you listen to his last interview right before this release with Peterson, they get way inside baseball, and it's almost unlistenable. But part of what they're doing is they're getting deep into cognitive science and these things to try to come up with scientific descriptions of things that could be like souls, or what they mean by that. Does that make sense? I've talked about it before, and I always use it's probably a bad metaphor. I don't even know what to do, but when I say people's knives are sharp, what I'm talking about is they just know all the arguments against them. And Vervaeke has some of the sharpest knives in the shed. It's like, if you can't go to Vervaeke and say, hey, you didn't think of this, and he hasn't read 6 books that says better, like entire books that says better the thing that you're going to say to him. And part of what it is each one of those things, I promise you, behind it, he's got 85 different references to neurological, scientific science stuff of what he's kind of getting at and meaning by that. Does that make sense? And because he's trying to justify it all in the natural world.
And that's why if I ever chat with him, he's gonna hate me because I hate that shit.
What do you hate?
Justifications and that kind of
Language.
So he makes a reference to it in the third one. He talks about analytical philosophers, and he points to where they are also wrong a little bit. I can maybe find the clip, but it's just kind of true of analytical philosophers. I've shown the meme a couple times of like somebody saying Kant is wrong because, and then the person who proves him wrong is sitting on top of his brain that's the size of an elephant that's up on top of still. And then that's kind of like pointing at Wittgenstein and different people who did kind of get into, we're going to go into every single neurological detail of all this sorts of stuff to prove the thing. And even Vervaeke says that those guys kind of miss or lose something once they start getting that far down into the weeds of analytical proofs. To kind of understand that, all you ever have to do is start looking way down into their analytical proofs and see that they do just construct these monstrosities of almost kind of like mathematical equations that are unintelligible, and once again would then have the problem of, well, how do we get everybody to agree that you guys figured it out when we're just looking at these major huge mathematical equations of stuff? And he made reference to it somewhere. I'd say to buy into the Plato stuff, you're going to have to buy in a little bit. I mean, that's why I say these parts are for the layman, is he's going to reel off of that inside baseball of the cognitive science that he has behind some of that stuff and just try to keep it I'll just say the word soul, right here.
That's what I think. I knew that, but I just, again, there's just this almost part of me watching it for other people watching it, and I'm like, people aren't going to be okay with that kind of language.
Well, and I don't know, because doesn't Vervaeke say he's a non-theist?
Yeah.
And that's what I say I am. And I mean, if it came down to it, I'd probably just settle for the word soul. I've tried to like ponder on it, ruminate on it for a minute. Is there something better? And that's one part where I'm just like, nah, it's just soul and spirit.
Yeah, spirit. That's another word
for this conversation, especially for just like settling for a large audience and moving on.
Yeah, that's true.
I think for me, like I noticed the soul comment as well, and I think like I think the problem, there was a little cognitive dissonance because Vervaeke, he's setting up a really academic approach, and then he throws in some woo-woo, and it's like, where did that come from?
But that's also the kind of like syncretism he's trying to do, right? Which is one thing that I like, because I just started talking to some neurologists in a world that I'm involved in, but also keeping my woo involved. And some of them are interested and some of them are not. And I think he's trying to kind of bridge that gap here too.
That's what I 100% think, because one of the overarching things, and one of the other things I've been on about, is that Plato and Socrates and Aristotle meant the woo. Does that make sense?
Yes.
But now they're saying, well, all this time later, I've said frequently that I think that what he's kind of trying to do is what Jefferson did to the Bible. Jefferson went and did a version of the Bible that took all the mysticism out of it. Mm-hmm. And I think he's kind of trying to take the direct mysticism while leaving options for people to hold on to that out of Plato. And
I think he's adding a different mysticism into it, because you can wipe the Greek Platonic Socratic mysticism out of it, but you're going to have to replace it with another mysticism, which is what he's doing, which is kind of to the point you said earlier of it's just gone through 2,000 years of being folded over and interwoven. And that's just, we're here at Vervaeke's version.
Yeah. I think it's hard, but I think he also kind of is doing the Peterson thing of saying, I've got to rescue the Western thing. You know what I mean? So it's almost kind of like you could just do all this and just start straight from the analytics and the cognitive science and all that stuff. But he's kind of buying into the Pageauan thing of like, we got to tell the story, and maybe the story we can tell is through Socrates through Plato, which we all could say that we all have a root in somewhere.
Yeah.
Which I think is the imagined angle of it, you know, and like I said, his intentions are thought out. He didn't, you know, not one of the things that I'm going to bring up about that isn't something that he didn't you know, sit there and think about hard. You know?
That might go back to why Jordan Peterson is trying to rescue Christianity, because that mysticism is still at least somewhat believed. He doesn't have to like create a new one.
Yeah, it's almost the same project, only this one's more based in the philosophical of these guys, and Peterson's going to hold to the Christianism of the West, you know.
Yeah.
But I think the Christianism, obviously, because it clashes with Vervaeke, I'm sure it clashes with I know it clashes with Seth and Christopher, probably Marti too, of saying, hey, no, we got to do the Christian one. We got to rescue the Christian one. Even if you're turning that Christianity into a kind of Platonism. Let's see here. These are Seth's notes. All right. So
I just want to let you know these notes, they actually come from the Vervaeke's video. He put these notes into the description.
Wow.
So yeah, they don't come from me.
Nice. Well, it's nice that you put those in there, that you found them. So, I mean, I guess we could go to some of the things if anything stands out for something that you remembered. And you want to know what? I listened to it twice, and this is where I know it's kind of difficult. Is the second time through, there was all sorts of stuff like, I don't even remember hearing this the first time, you know? And,
yeah. I have the same problem. I don't know what it is. It seems like Vervaeke is, I don't know, it just kind of flows in one ear and out the other sometimes. It's like,
or maybe you're stopping thinking about another point and he's already 3 points down the road and you didn't hear him, and then
yeah.
Well, I thought we could also go over the end of his video. So far, so I've made it through 2. I didn't even get to the third one, but
really?
They did the meditation, the first one, and then the second one, he had 2 other practices, rooting, and then what's the other one called? So I thought
down
those
at the
were
bottom of it. The meditation is not a vacation; it is an education. Is that the?
Yeah, I don't know if
It's like
no, that's the very end. This would have been probably like an hour in, because the whole last half hour was him teaching you how to.
The monkey mind, restlessness and distraction, unsettled, capricious, whimsical, fanciful. Salience, because I thought once he started getting into the meditation stuff, he kind of started doing too much lingo. Maybe he still did.
Mostly he was just teaching you how to meditate.
But even his meditations, I guarantee they're based off of some sort of cognitive science studied meditation, which I think Christopher brought up to me, having an issue with that. He talked about in the first one, like if you put your head down into your chest, it mimics the idea of going to sleep or something like that, if I remember right.
Yeah.
And I'm positive that he could give you 75 papers on 75 is a joke, but he could give you something that very, very specifically talks about huge studies on doing that.
No doubt, yeah.
But I think as far as meditation,
to meditate twice a day.
Oh yeah,
in the morning and at night.
Anyone done that?
I did it once.
You did?
You know what's interesting is, okay, so I did it it was last Sunday, and then I think it was the next Monday. I got like 3 things off of my to-do list that have been sitting there for like a week.
Really? You think it helped with a lot?
Well, it's weird. I mean, it's a strange coincidence, but.
So did you think about them during meditation, or did it help later? Because like you're not supposed to think about it in meditation.
No, I didn't think about them.
Why?
It was just, I don't know. I was just able to do
So
it.
Christopher, you kind of do meditations yourself, right? Or no?
Yeah, I've meditated every day for the past like 5 years.
And so how would you critique it or recommend a different way, to use his term, the way?
I don't necessarily recommend a different way, but I guess where I'd critique it is
recommending a way is the problem, right?
Yeah, but also not necessarily, because I've been through all 6 episodes that are released so far, and the first 3 a few times, and I've done the first 3 meditations a handful of times. Sorry, I just kind of fibro fogged out. the specificities. So it's not necessarily, it's okay. And he did bring this up for the first like 5 to 8 weeks. He may have said 6 to 8 weeks. It is really good to establish that habit and have a technique or a method, a way you sit, a way you come into your body. I don't really like his language of finding a center. And I don't really want to get into that yet, but we can maybe later. So it's a yes and no. He's doing an introduction to a practice that maybe people haven't done, or maybe they want to try a different version of a practice they already have. So there's nothing wrong with that. But I did things like where to position your head and all that. In the end, bullshit.
Yeah, so I tried it once. I tried them all the first time I heard it, just kind of sitting there doing it. And I think there's definitely something that I can almost feel immediately. I do agree, just kind of putting your head down and like putting yourself into this like sleeping position kind of signifies something to the body a little bit.
Yeah, and it can some people, absolutely.
Oh, it's almost the fetal position when you're curling up. Right?
Yeah, and I'd actually heard something somewhere else that I can't even quote it because like I can't remember where, but like if you put your hands like this, like it's a bit like the fetal position, that almost kind of helps too. I totally believe that can help with that sort of thing, and then centering, and then I like the idea of noticing all your senses.
Yeah,
that's really cool. Like that's probably pretty typical meditation stuff, no?
That's like the basic introduction thing is kind of notice each and every one of your senses, all your limbs, everything of that about you, and bring it into just noticing it all at once as a cloud of sensation. And once you really get, and there's a lot of different, I learned something in college called the Alexander technique, which is something that actors use to isolate their body and come upon the same sensation as well. It's not necessarily a meditation, but it is. And that is a very good and vital practice, because once you do master that, like he says, it's like building a muscle. You can just sit down and you're there. You don't have to spend the first 5 minutes or whatever kind of like muddling through it and getting used to it. You just sit down and you arrive into your meditation. I do kind of like this point, and it's in the same world. This is why Mormons and other religions say to close your eyes and cross your arms or do this, because any and all of that is just finding a center or becoming a cloud sensation and feeling the spirit, getting in touch with all of that. It's all the same idea.
That's actually, I was curious, how does this relate to how I was practicing and I don't know that I really meditated very much.
Yeah, Mormonism doesn't really teach you that. I've thought a lot about this because I was very stoic. I think it's just also kind of a Greek thing and part of my upbringing. And even in the celestial room, it just wasn't the same meditative approach that I have now.
Did any of you feel meditative in the celestial room?
Not there. That's like where we get in there and we go.
You get funneled out real quick. Right?
You did, Seth?
I didn't. I was able to sit for a while sometimes. So I did, but it's just not the same. Yeah, Seth, what was yours?
Yeah, well, I kind of view prayer as a type of meditation. There's probably thousands of types of meditation. I kind of view it as, just calm down and point your brain towards something. And so if in prayer, you're pointing your brain towards the idea of God. And so I view that as a type of meditation. And, if you get to the point in where you're praying for 20 minutes at a time, like that's a significant mental exercise. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah. I don't think I ever got, no, wait, there was the one time on my mission that I really tried to do Moroni's promise. And I went for a long time and I didn't get anywhere with it.
I did grateful prayers like that. I had someone that was like, do a prayer where you do nothing but say what you're grateful for and think about what you're grateful for a certain amount of time. And I would do that occasionally.
So this kind of hints, because it's at the end of the episodes, but it's all through the episodes too, if you really think about it. But I think one of the reasons he chooses Plato is going back to those Greeks and those pre-modern thinkers. There's a whole bunch about it that is saying you are your body. and your body is part of your learning and knowing and understanding process. And it's all weaved throughout it. It's talking about like how you perceive things and how you sense things and how things might be more salient to you or not. And it's all kind of just built upon processes that are going on inside of you, or the phenomenology of how your eyes take in the world, or how your nose takes in smells or something like that. That is, you're stuck with your senses, and your senses are part of your knowing. Have you, I don't think he's gone into it yet, but Vanderklay always talks about Vervaeke has his 4 P's of knowing, which are
Like the propositional.
yeah,
Perspectival.
yep, propositional, perspectival, procedural, which I think is a huge one that gets lost in atheistic postmodern world, which might be a little bit, and participatory. Both those two, like those 2 levels, because there's something about physically being a part of something,
Because I think the participatory and the procedural are more, those bring in or open the gate, however you want to say, for free will and determinism, that debate. Those 2 ways of knowing how you know what I'm saying. I think that's why those maybe get lost in the weeds or forgotten about, because they open a whole new can of worms.
Yeah, but there is something about figuring out how you understand the world better with your body. Like your body's got to be a part of the process, going to the place, all facing the same direction, or I don't know, sitting in a circle.
Yeah, that circular, like you're putting data out there and then you're receiving data back in, and it's like that circular, right?
And then it's procedural, like you're gonna do it every Sunday, and you're gonna do it this point and this point, like you're gonna check it off the list, and that helps not just grow the community, but it's growing, like he's saying, it's a type of knowing, and I think there's some truth to that, in as much as like figuring out or learning yourself, or learning how you perceive the world, or how you know what you know, because so much of Socrates is figuring out how you know what you know. And then secondly, the other thing that I think why Socrates is such a huge thing for him to bring up is he's talking about how your knowing is very, very much based in your dialogue with others. It's not just you. Your dialogue with others is part of your knowing. It's like the answers talking and batting stuff off of people, and batting ideas off other people, and figuring out how to get along with other ideas. But even beyond that, you kind of can't quite understand some stuff unless you're getting a secondary view of it sometimes, or you're able to see something in somebody else that they can't see.
Yeah, I'll just to let you guys know, like my Transcendent Philosophy project, like one of the key ideas is like the dialectic. And so this idea of, coming together, conversation, like collective intelligence, building, a better perspective. Like from my point of view, like this is like the most important thing for our society at this point in time. So like I'm super like happy that he's like emphasizing that aspect so much with this series.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And it's kind of it's both esoteric a little bit, but and understanding, like the way he's really saying what dialogue is, and understanding from second person ideas, which I think he gets more of that in the 3rd episode. I don't know if you heard it yet, Marty, but I know that you've heard that from Vervaeke before. So Taoism is the way stuff. It's just like finding the ways. But so that's why I say it's interwoven all throughout the episodes, because this Taoism stuff, the way isn't just like coming up with your brain, like the way, part of the way is going and doing and acting. So like there's the action stuff mixed in all throughout it.
I wanted to ask you guys what you thought about the section on imaginal versus imaginary.
Imagination is fantasizing. We often reference it the unreal or the illusory. Imaginal is to enhance the perception and insight, the realm of imagination where we encounter the deeper patterns of being.
So that's interesting. I don't know that I can totally tell the difference. That sounds a lot like I'm doing. My brother bought me. Well, he bought himself a buy one get one free self-authoring thing like 3 years ago, and that was one of the things on my to-do list that I actually successfully did a session of writing. But that's what it suggests as well, is it talks about when you're writing to try to be in a state of kind of just letting yourself daydream a little bit. So I don't know, maybe there obviously is something there.
My favorite part of the first episode was this imaginal part. Like Vervaeke was kind of humorous because he starts to act out the Indian or the hunter or gatherer who's like tracking an animal. He's like saying these ancient cultures, they would embody the animal that they're hunting. Basically, they're trying to, it's like first person imagination. It's not the animal isn't some third person object that I'm imagining. I'm embodying it with my imagination. And that really brought me back to the whole Christian idea of trying to be like Jesus, like I'm imagining how to be like Socrates instead of what would Socrates do? You know what I mean?
Well, there was something else he said too that was so much along the lines of just like, oh, insert yourself into the text, like, oh, I, Christopher, having been born of goodly parents,
But that's so much what he's asking to do, and that's a little bit where I said I'm going to try to do buy-in instead of just be the skeptic this time, which is a little bit of let's stop and try to think like these pre-modern guys for a little bit here. Like these guys didn't know what blood was, they didn't know what a soul was, they didn't know what breath was, you know, but they were still kind of hitting on something about the patterns they noticed and the ways to that they could put their brains into second person's brain and imagine. So it's like empathy type stuff, like being able to think in somebody else's shoes a little bit and how that happens, or if it happens at all, or if it's all just imaginal.
Yeah, there was another thing that seemed throughout the first one and the second one. Well, maybe not so much the second one, but it was really study this. That's when he was gave the books on Plato and Socrates, and he's like, really study this and see what it means for your life. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that brought me back to church. Read the scriptures and how is this like? What does this mean for your everyday life? Anyway, it was just that it's hard to not be like. It's hard to take that seriously. Like there's such a paradox in trying to take this seriously, even though I think it would be helpful for me, but it is really hard.
It's such a hard sell with people who've come through something like a Mormonism or something like that.
So easy to make fun of it and so hard to take it seriously.
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering if I should redo the series without all the inside baseball language. Just make it a simple, like half-hour video each time.
From the start, I tried to pretend I didn't know much about Plato, and I was gonna try to I'm gonna try to not be the skeptic this time and all that stuff, and try to stop and think how he's trying to ask me to think. And I did it like a little bits of time, but I not much time. Like I can't live in that long, but I did.
I know I felt something at least once in each video where I felt I knew what he was talking about, and it made me excited. It's like, wouldn't it be so cool to be able to live my life like this, where I'm feeling this and I'm feeling like that direction, like
yeah, totally.
Yeah, but again, it's really easy to make fun of and really hard to take seriously. So,
well, I think one of the most important parts is, if I'm remembering correctly, Vervaeke was talking about how this imaginal thing, that's actually psychologically important for transformation.
Yeah.
Like if you want to actually transform yourself, you have to put it in that first person perspective.
And that's also an Eastern thing. That's a concept out of the Zhuangzi that you'll read several times.
Really?
How to take on that perspective of other people.
But I mean, it goes to Peterson, and it goes just the general concept of idealism itself. You know what I mean? The whole idealism is you can somewhat see that peak of the mountain and imagine yourself going to that peak of that mountain, and maybe it's all imaginary. You know what I mean?
But we're talking about the Greeks, and when you get up to the top of the mountain, it's just a fake Zeus and a bunch of clouds.
Yeah, but you have Plato, he's got like the peak of the mountain. This is like, we brought it up before, like when Peterson was talking about that woman not being beautiful on Twitter or something like that. I point to that as being like him talking about a Platonism It's like they're supposed to be put in the peak of the mountain that you're supposed to have the ideal of searching for, you know, because he's never not in that mode.
Yeah.
So the idea is like, what are we putting in people's heads to aim at? And there's imagination in that, no matter what. And as soon as you start imagining it, you're doing something a little bit religious or you're abstracting. And this is why Nietzsche hated this stuff. You know, he thought it was all just building sandcastles, or he called them cobwebs. Like you're building up big fake things. But you could also see the other side of it as saying like, nope, I'm gonna do good things with my life doing this framework. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think that's largely what Vervaeke's on about.
Yeah, totally. He's read Nietzsche. Like, I'm not going to surprise him with Nietzsche's complaints about it. You know.
So along this point of the imaginal triggering the transformation, like to me, it seems obvious that Vervaeke, he's trying to inspire us to transform ourselves into something more like Socrates, into like a sage, right?
Yeah.
But like I'm starting like watching Vervaeke's approach and then thinking back to the Mormon approach. And I'm starting to see a gap, which is Vervaeke is very like academic, very terminologically heavy, very bookish in a way. And religion is very story oriented. It goes to the narrative. And I think that imaginal stuff, it happens when you're in the story, right? You put yourself in Jesus's shoes and you're like, this is how to embody love. You know what I mean?
And that's where you get more community buy-in, because people can come in and if they take it literally or they start getting up to this platonic understanding of something, the stories is what keeps them and brings them. So that's actually kind of one of Pageau's, he's been in conversation with Pageau. That's Pageau's critique of the whole entire thing, is that he doesn't lean on story enough. Although the story of Socrates is kind of a Western story. So, I mean, it's a little bit story, although it's supposedly based in some realities as far as we know.
Yeah. Well, I think he would do well to like actually go through the dialogues of Socrates and kind of walk people through how to embody Socrates in a dialogue. You know what I mean?
He plans on doing that with his friend, Christopher.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. And so like, because if you think about it,
6, you've gone through 6, right, Chris?
not by 6. It's not there yet.
6. He didn't specify, but he did say that the whole thing would not be lectures. I'm guessing the first 10 are going to be just John.
He does also say he's going to get to the Neoplatonism, and I guarantee it's going to get weird when it gets there.
Number 6, I think was the first time he mentioned nous and all that kind of stuff. Yeah,
and that's gonna. I mean, I don't know how to not be inside baseball and talk about that stuff. You know.
Yeah. Can't really.
And then he does start referencing his old episodes, and I think Seth was telling me earlier, like, I think you're gonna have to go back and reference some stuff and read some old. Like, you can't just be just this. You're gonna have to read the outside sources, and.
But that's where I don't know. I feel like maybe we can avoid some of that, because I feel like I have 2 different vocabularies to just kind of bring it to the surface for some other people.
For sure. Yeah, I'm not saying that because some of us who've been in this stuff, we already kind of know the extra references. But I was just imagining this being like somebody coming to it cold. You know?
Oh yeah, they'd be lost.
You know, this stuff here kind of gets. This is the second episode. This metaxy idea. Being between the human and the divine, being a monster in between. I mean, that stuff starts sounding Peterson-y, don't you think?
Mm-hmm.
The arrow stuff gets very weird with Plato because I don't know if a lot of people know this, but like there's certain ideas that like the concept of the symposium all happen in the middle of an orgy.
Yeah.
You know, and beyond that too. Some of the ideas or thoughts behind that too is that in that time frame, those sorts of orgies weren't necessarily. Some of the people there were sex workers. Does that make sense? And who knows of what age and that sort of deal. But that's getting into current era criticisms of the old timey stuff. The monster distorts the normal categories. In a way that all sounds super Peterson-y to me, especially when we went through it. And I like Peterson going over that stuff. I like the ideas of like category and monsters and the in-between and stuff like that. Pajau gets into that stuff like crazy too. Dialogue. He knows that he does not know, but he knows that he knows stuff.
That was a kind of a cool clip. I'll find it though.
Have you guys noticed? I don't know if you noticed, but you can kind of notice things in this where so many other philosophies jumped off of using this as a poking point. Like you can see where the way that he can get you questioning, like, what is anything? And it can only ever be like an infinite regress of referring to another thing to understand another thing. You can get like where, oh, that's Derrida. You know, Derrida decided to go all the way with that and poke the living hell out of that. And almost all of it kind of stems back to some of the stuff these guys were saying.
It's later. He kind of hints to it here, but he talks about it more at 35. It's just that paradox of him saying he had like 3 quotes from Socrates and how
Episode 2, right?
Yeah. Like, what are his famous quotes? An unexamined life is not a life worth living. And then he's
yes. Mm-hmm.
about knowledge. And then you can't have knowledge without virtue, and you can't have virtue without knowledge or something. And he says, I have neither, or I don't know. It was some kind of paradoxical thing that he said he was claiming that if you let this bounce around in your head, then anyways, yeah.
Let me see. I think I'm about at it.
Have the knowledge needed for virtue. How do those hang together? How can that be the case? And you can say, well, maybe Socrates, if you put those 3 together, you can put them together and say, well, Socrates is just realizing he's just kind of a buffoon. And of course, there were people that thought that. Aristophanes famously in his play, The Clouds.
Do you guys know about that play?
Mm-mm.
So that play, and some people supposedly through history went back in time and accidentally attributed it all to Socrates. But you got to imagine it's like a comic play making fun of Socrates and kind of straw manning him. And
you had to know that was going on.
Oh, yeah. But a lot of different people started attributing some of the crap that happened that Aristophanes attributed to Socrates himself. And it was like a total spoof on Socrates. Why is that not making volume now, or is it just pause? Aristophanes was a famous comic player of ancient Athens. His play, The Clouds, gives a critical portrayal of Socrates as a man of nonsense and deception. Socrates addresses the slander in Plato's Apology.
But Socrates claims to know what a good life is, such that he is willing to die for it. How does that fit in with that, right? That doesn't fit in with being a buffoon. And Plato clearly and repeatedly presents Socrates as the most virtuous person living the most worthwhile and virtuous life. At the end of the Phaedo, this is the dialogue in which Socrates actually dies. After Socrates is dead, these last words are spoken. Very last words, super salient. The culmination point of the dialogue, not really, but yes, here, salient, at the end, where we're supposed to reflect upon everything else. Such was the end, Echecrates, of our friend, Socrates, who's just died, of our friend, whom I may truly, call the wisest and justest, most just, and best of all men, best of all men.
This does kind of ring back to some Mormonism, doesn't it?
Whom I have ever known.
I just felt goosebumps, you know. Holy Spirit.
That is the Spirit. Yeah.
Isn't that funny? Like the fact that he died like that too, right?
For our sins. Oh, wait, no.
That was in the play. Wait.
Is this the case? How could this be the case?
Some of those pregnant pauses are.
How could that learned ignorance give Socrates the knowledge of the good life, the confidence in it for which he's willing to die? How could that thing that challenges all of our assumptions about the good life, how could that make him the wisest, the most virtuous, living the most worthwhile life? How? How could we possibly realize this, understand it, and such that we could put it into practice? When you roll this around in your mind, it feels like a profound paradox. He seems to be not knowing, and yet he seems to have all of the results of the knowing that he says he does not have and does not know. This feels monstrous. Doesn't fit in any of our categories. He's not a buffoon, but he's not the typical successful person. He doesn't seem to have knowledge, but he seems to be wise. Like, what's going on? Now, in response to this, and many people have done this, they even do it in the dialogues. Plato repeatedly shows that. You can just reject Socrates. You can say, he's just confused. He's just all messed up. You can just turn away. You can reorient yourself away from the Socratic path. It's easy to do, but that ease is only superficial, because if you stop and reflect at a deeper level, it's actually harder to turn away, to disorient yourself from the Socratic way.
There's this old joke by Michel Foucault. He's talking about the dialectic, but he's talking about Hegel's dialectic, but it still all stems from this. And he says, the dialectic's like a big monster standing in front of you in the path, and you can turn away from the monster and turn down the other way of the path, and then you look down the other way of the path, and there's that monster standing down at the other way of the path, which is also Hegel. And it's kind of the idea that it's kind of baked into it, that if you turn it down, in a sense, you're doing it. You know what I mean? This idea of the dialectic, or negating or denying the dialectic.
You can't escape it.
You cannot escape it. You know?
I felt like this was a theme kind of throughout this whole episode, was just this idea that you can't, once you think you've got it, you don't have it, because there's nothing to have. Like you can't actually get to the top of the mountain. Like, that's not the point. The point is aiming for the top of the mountain. But
I saw somebody say that as soon as you set atop of the mountain, you necessarily make that thing unreachable. If that makes sense. Like, the moment you've called it the top of the mountain, you'll never exactly arrive to that.
Or if you reach it, then what? It's either way, it's not good.
But that gets into Plato and Plato's forms and all that sorts of stuff too. The idea of the perfect version of every type of thing that's out there, and can we ever see it or know it, or does it, once you find that perfect thing, does it exist as its own entity, as that perfect thing out in the universe? Which I think Plato, he believed it pretty straight out that way, that they're in this secondary, as Nietzsche would call it, this Hinterwelt, this secondary realm. There is the perfect thing there, the perfect cup, the perfect chair, the perfect, I don't know what, the chair that encompasses all chairs. And it gets really weird. It's strange contemplating it in that way of thinking. But go ahead.
So how did you guys feel about the whole the religious epistemology of, if someone died for it, it must be true and good, right?
You're picking up on something I was going to say. Is like, but maybe that's one of the tropes you got to use to get buy-in. You know, like, we got to find a martyr. You know.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I don't think I didn't notice it right away, but you're right. I felt it, because I was just like, there's so much of that was like that, though. That felt like church, like, and like, I don't know. Maybe he is doing it on purpose. But
maybe that's been part of the story of Socrates all along, because from all along, it's if you get a martyr, you're going to get better buy-in for it, because they went the whole distance of their idealism of dying for their ideal. Yeah, it does all smack of the same.
Yeah, it's Christianity, it's Mormonism. The apostles, they died for it. It's true.
There's all of that. There's Eastern and Mormonism, and it's, I don't remember who said it first, but it is syncretism. It's so much of everything. And even you can even say this when he's talking about the learned ignorance, and how Socrates talks about how he knows and whatnot and doesn't know. That is Taoism 101. That's Zen Buddhism meditation 101. That kind of understanding. And honestly, it's reasonable to assume, one could assume, whether or not it's written anywhere, that one person way back then, over the span of their life, could have met Socrates, Lao Tzu, Confucius, and the Buddha, I think. And so it's feasible that this knowledge was widespread throughout that whole region of the world, honestly. And now we're reaching a point where it is all being synthesized on a global platform for all to see, instead of just those pockets of the world,
Yeah, and once again, like you said, people can just turn away from it. Some of the people who did, and like I said, Nietzsche in Twilight of the Idols, he just says all this is crap. Like, there's a real world, you can just do this real stuff. And I'd say a lot of analytic or naturalists, that's why he brings up the analytic philosophers here. What's it say? Iris Murdoch was a prominent British philosopher of the second half of the 20th century, best known for her moral philosophy. She combined her grounding in Wittgenstein and linguistic analytic philosophy with a strong influence of 19th and 20th century continental philosophy, Christian religion and thought, and Hindu and Buddhist philosophy. I don't even remember that moment, and I listened this morning. But I do remember him talking about analytic philosophy. I think it was in the third one here. But he did say it somewhere in that, where he talks about some people kind of pushed back, saying that it's the real world's just real, and we don't need all these constructs or things. And I think there's kind of something in between all that, because I think no matter what, there is some sort of a sandcastle creation in our epistemologies, no matter what. And so I think Plato's a little bit right about that, no matter what. And then there's some sort of level of like, but the real world,
Where do you think that comes from? Is that because we're trying to live in like a civilization? Is that why?
Which part? Where does what come from?
Just that you get to the bottom of a lot of these philosophies, and then you end up having to take some kind of faith move.
Yeah.
Like, animals don't need to do that, right? They're just living. So is it because we're trying to live in like civilizations? Is that, do you know what I mean? It
seems like all of it, to one sense or another, has been somewhat part of the evolutionary process to bind and blind groups, together. To me, if we all buy into the same constructs or get some sort of shared belief system, that it's gonna unite better and prove to be more successful over time, possibly, until it isn't, because it never seems to last either.
My brain kind of went a lot of places, but there was something else. Why do we do it? What was your question? Maybe they'll just spark it again.
Yeah, so it seems like we have to have some kind of faith claim at the bottom of our belief structures. Everyone seems to have that at some point. And why? Like, animals don't seem to need it, but we do. Like, is it because
there's another,
we're living differently than animals in some way, like the civilization part?
There's, Seth, you can go ahead. I'll leave a note.
Okay. So I think I don't know if this is right, but I'm thinking of the dichotomy between empiricism and rationality, or the dichotomy between natural, just like that which is natural, and like the structure of logic, right? Like humans, we build these structures of logic where it's like, here's my premise and here's my conclusion. You know what I mean? The problem with the whole project of logic is that it turns into an infinite regress. It's like, okay, what justifies your premise? Here's another premise, and you can always go backwards and say, what's the premise before that? And it's a losing game because it's infinite. And so eventually the buck has to stop somewhere, and you say, I'm just going to stop here. This is my faith, right? And I think that's
what we agree on.
I think that's a problem with the structure of logic, where I don't think it's necessary. It's only necessary within logic.
And so what I was getting at, that's still kind of along that line, is this is where most, I would say, everyone misses the point, because your question is one of the most vital ones, because animals aren't really doing that. And so I'm going to ramble for a minute because there's a lot here. There was another word specifically that Vervaeke uses, and I don't know if he's necessarily lifting it from Taoism, but it's very prominent in Taoism, and that is virtue. And the more you study Taoism, the less the specific word virtue being tied to it becomes it's not as relevant. But in, I guess, Taoism 101, so you have Tao and De. Tao is your salience landscaping, it's your field, it's the world you're living in. And De, a lot of the times, is virtue. And to your point, it's not the virtue we were taught in Mormonism. It's not being chaste and all of that niceties and dispositional stuff that doesn't matter. Virtue is being like an animal or like a plant. It's plants heal other plants underground just because their roots sense iron deficiencies and things like that, and so they'll send some their way to the other plant. Like we've found that kind of stuff. That's the kind of virtue that Taoism and Socrates are getting at. That to know that you don't know is to embody, to go back to what we were talking about earlier, the view of someone else or the view of an animal, and to act with learned ignorance, which is just the Wu forms in Taoism, except for I think he distorts learned ignorance into something that it isn't really, because it's getting into it's much like Mormonism. You have to hold your head this way and do the meditation this way, and you have to know these terms. And I'm going off a little bit, but I remember now. The way he uses virtue, and I don't remember exactly, is one way that distorts what Socrates is really getting at. And I think that's one area John Vervaeke kind of goes off on.
So Aristotle, a lot of people kind of know that Aristotle, as much as being a follower and somebody who picked up and continued with Plato and Platonism, he also went against him quite a bit. And most of how he did that was getting into the concept of ethics, which he got into depth about virtue versus vice, So he'd kind of push on saying, you go too far with virtue, you got a problem. You go too far with vice, you got a problem. And so he'd put the different virtues and vices at other ends from each other, if that makes sense. And it was kind of a bit of a critique of Socrates or Plato. But I agree with everything I said, and I think there's a lot of people who talk about or theorize that everything right down to our language, to our imaginations and all that stuff is what's called like a spandrel. And the spandrel is, it's this thing in architecture where you get this accidental shape out of making other shapes. And so some people will point to it and say, oh, all of our stuff was just, we were surviving beings and surviving animals, and the whole entire world of coming into thinking and logic and awareness and all that sorts of stuff was just more ways for us to figure out how to stay alive and get food. And it was even accidental that we even got to the levels of being able to paint up these big sandcastles and all that stuff. But I think no matter what, we're in that world, and if it's that and it's just evolution doing its thing, or if it's not, if it's something bigger and brighter and there is something transcendent there, I can see where Vervaeke would choose this arena for something that, like, anybody who thinks any which way could maybe kind of unify up and see that, hey, I think my ideas, I can base it all on a hard science, or, oh, hey, I think my ideas, I can base it in some sort of shared imaginative framework. Maybe we can all just at least unite over here and have dialogue. I mean, because half of what all this stuff is how to dialogue with each other. And I don't know. But how many people, one of the things Christopher noticed, I don't know if this is still true, but we noticed that each episode had lower views across time. And that just
I
might
noticed
be,
this first one had a ton, and then not so much moving on.
yeah, and that's a
too bad.
data point. That's a data point for sure, because you'd hope it would go the other direction. But that's something else that you have to stop and think about, is like Peterson talking about the Bible and stuff like that. It's shot to the moon, right?
Mhm.
And why? Why does that shoot to the moon? And I think so many different people have stopped and tried to figure out why that one shot to the moon. And
Yeah, it's all considerably. So from 1 to 6, 62,000, 22,000, 15,000, 9.6, 6.5, 3.4.
He is moving faster than Ike.
True.
I will watch them. So there's that.
It's
yeah,
not.
I thought he was gonna do one a
2 week.
week.
Yeah, 2 a week is if you're gonna take it seriously. Like, I really can do one a weekend.
Mhm.
I've got a lot of time on my hands right now.
Mhm.
It's basically taking up my free time, and I'm not giving it all my free time. So I could do it if it was my priority, and it just hasn't been. But maybe that's another thing, right? Usually church is people that is a priority. You do that. That's what you do every week, right?
Yeah, you squeeze it in even if the other stuff's going on, because it's more
Right.
important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Well, I don't know. Anything else on this third episode? He started talking about the Neoplatonism stuff and how some people could like argue with him about some of the historical accuracy, but he's trying to pick up on what the actual practice was through the time, because so much of it's so old that he's going to try to work backwards and
Yeah, he's reverse engineering.
to try to figure out what exactly Plato's dialectic was, because they only ever mentioned it. They never gave but then he thinks maybe the idea of it was for them to never give a direct
Which is what I was just getting at.
yeah.
is that like pre-apologetics right there then?
Yeah.
Like,
Everything.
well, yeah, it's interesting. Like, I have these thoughts, like when we were talking about Socrates dying, and it's just like we probably have a pretty good idea that he died the way that everyone understands that he died, right? But at the same time, if someone found some kind of hole and found out, oh, he wasn't actually a martyr, he did this too, or something, like he actually did this really terrible thing. And it's like, it's funny because the apologists are kind of right when they're defending the church, even, because it's like, that's not the point of church. That's their best argument. But then you kind of get into this like literal, like what literally happened, and it's like, it's the story that's more important, right?
Yeah, I had two thoughts. So, which is one reason how like having Lao Tzu as a sage is important, because that you don't have to have one sage. And something that Christopher Hitchens said, because he was big on Socrates, which was that's really different because we're talking about someone had to die for it, the martyr, very Mormon and other religious thing. Christopher Hitchens made the point that it doesn't matter if Socrates was even a real person, just like it doesn't matter if Lao Tzu was a real person, because the ideas are there. And at number two, it doesn't matter that he died for it, and I don't remember exactly how he worded it, because for Christ, it does matter that he died for it, because that is a pinnacle part of the story. Socrates, he was just a guy philosophizing, going about his Greek life. People didn't like it, much like Galileo, they fucking killed him, different part of the world. For Christ, it matters for your mortal soul whether or not he actually lived and actually did what he did. For Socrates, it doesn't matter. And where is John along that spectrum? Does it matter that Socrates was a martyr for it? Does it matter that Socrates actually lived? Does it matter that Plato actually lived? Or is it just the ideas?
Right.
Yeah, if this could work and start to actually resonate with me, even, I do care if it resonates with other people too, but it would be helpful because it is hard to tear down something that like isn't. It doesn't matter, right? If it's literally the thing.
Yeah, one of the things that people never like to admit or talk about is how much this stuff actually did get into Christianity. And so there's always the idea of like, did the Christian thing really happen or not? Or was Christianity already an imagined up version of this? If that
Right.
makes sense.
Yeah.
And of course, the Christians are going to say, no, it was real and all that sort of stuff. But even if you go and like, a lot of people don't realize that some of the letters of Paul was talking to Platonists.
Yeah.
Or people,
And one of the things that I used to, because that's very true. One of the things that I used to talk about early on in my ex-Mormonism was we still don't know where Christ was between the ages of fucking 12 to 30 or some odd, you know? And there is other evidence out there that he was back in I think it was specifically the Navana Valley of India or something like that, learning this stuff. And Taoistic Buddhism, it's all over what Christ said in the Bible with Christian language. It's again, same game, different name thing. And you made me kind of piece that all together of how it brought us here. I don't remember really my point, but those were my thoughts.
Just that there was, the ideas were all swirling around before and in and around the time of when the Christ thing actually happened, and how much do we know of that did or didn't happen. And we know that, go ahead.
Well, because I was going to say, because we don't even know if Christ was influenced by Taoistic or Buddhistic thought. Like we live in a largely Christian world, but it still could be foundationally based off of Eastern thought or, Greek thought combined. Who knows?
Well, we also know that Plato pulled from Egyptian thought quite a bit. And it's strangely enough, and Nietzsche would say this too, is that he thinks that it was kind of like the foundational point of what kind of created all these different sorts of cults. But then, of course, in Christianity, many times over the past 2,000 years, people started trying to really go back to the roots of this stuff, and they get it called heresies, and they get murdered for it being called a heresy to bring the stuff back up. And the weird thing about it all is that it just might all kind of be the same roots of ideas swelling around and turning this idea, this part of it up to 11, and turning this part up to an 11, and doing a new version of it, and then doing a version of it. And that's really been the West, and that's what we've been living in. And rescuing it, getting it to all back to one single point, or getting it to where we can all use it again. Maybe, but who knows? There's also the whole other thing that like maybe we're just growing beyond all of that. It just took 2,000 years, but then I think most people like Vervaeke think that might leave us in or Peterson, that might leave us just completely out to sea, and kind of just in danger of making worse ideas or something like that. And I agree with those cautions and all that sort of stuff. And this is why I'm just kind of in this endless pit myself of not knowing of like, thou should we just leave it all behind and drop it all, or what do we hold on to? And I don't know. And then, to me, like the stuff Christopher knows and all that stuff is just like a whole different realm of the world that I should probably get into better or know more. I saw John Lynn had an episode about Buddhism for Dummies or something like that.
I haven't watched that one yet.
Did you listen to it?
No, I turned on the notification, but I was too busy. I haven't watched it yet.
Yeah, so one way or the other, I'm going to say this. The West for 2,500 years has been a hot mess. That's all there is to it. But a bunch of civilization got made out of it. It's so funny because Nietzsche says the beginning of the death of the West was Plato.
He's not wrong, really.
That is the West.
The decline went on the timeline at that point. Of course, it started to fall.
It's 2,000 year upstream of all this sorts of weird stuff, but and also we don't know much before that. But that's where it went wrong.
As far as we know.
And yet we're going back to it.
Yeah.
Well, and see, that was another thought I had. Is like, we're going back to it, but there's so many other things we don't know. Like and I doubt there's any way Vervaeke would mention this, but there's just so much evidence out there and other scholarship that says that, and maybe he would, maybe he has, and I just spaced it because I've listened to way too much Vervaeke lately. Greek culture, Greek society, almost en masse, was largely a psychedelic endeavor. The beers they were brewing had ergot in them. They were basically drinking LSD laced beer a lot of the time, and going and doing things on full and new moons with it, and sacred geometry. There's a lot of woo there. And so for all we know, we just need to get back to the woo and not knowing all this salience landscaping perspectival procedural bullshit, knowing terms about it.
It's definitely making a comeback. There's so much interest in psychedelics right now.
Yeah, and all this stuff kind of gets blended back in, and I think more people are going to know about Platonism just generally because they're going to turn back to it. There's a lot of different people are also trying to like rescue like different pagan thoughts, which a lot of it was borrowed from, and I mean there's so much intermarrying of all these different things throughout our time frame. But what I think is something that there's value in this, whether it helps you see and understand the world or not, is that you start to learn how a lot of other people around us and in recent history thought or figured things out or tried to imagine up there. Like the sandcastles they built. You're going to know better the sandcastles everybody around us have built, or even how somebody 150 years ago was pulling from some sort of, the Kabbalah uses this stuff, Sikhs use this stuff. You're going to just understand better that there's some sort of root or seed inside of religions that are all kind of similarly based in these sorts of things. And so you can get to understand the West all over the place a little bit better. Well, and then I guess it's the East too, saying where it mixed in with Islam and that sort of stuff. Because like if you go read what the Tawhid is in Islam, which is their God. Go read the Tawhid and then go read Plato's description of the one. And tell me like what's different.
Well, the Islamic Empire, they preserved all the Greek records,
Yeah, they're the reasons
during
we have
the collapse. Yeah. So I had a question for everyone if we want to switch gears a little.
Yeah.
So Chris, you mentioned earlier that you hope that this type of a project succeeds, right?
A type, not somebody can get people to kind of unify around, I don't know what, just some sort of ethic that's better than what we've had in the past. And that's as vague as it is, because I cannot imagine much of
do you think it would be useful for us to articulate what we hope to see happen through projects like these, and maybe how they could be improved?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I know that you, Seth, have some ideas, especially, but you're also thinking of the East a whole lot. But I know that you've had some imagined up thoughts of like how philosophy could unify people.
Yeah, you want me to go first a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. Because I've already gone, because my thing is I've overly been a critic, and I say stuff's got to go, and I've always, like every bad critic, hedged off of positing positive stuff. So this is just me just barely tipping my tiptoes into the water of this stuff. But I agree with some of the stuff each of the three of you said. Marty's been hard on got a dialogue. And I know that's some of your guys' stuff too, but it's one area that I purposefully avoid, like every coward critic.
Yeah. So I think if I was to articulate what I would hope to see from a project like this, I think it's pretty much in line with what you were saying earlier, Chris, which is like kind of a way to ideologically unify, right? Because it feels like society is fracturing to a dangerous degree. Like the statistics I've seen on polarization are kind of scary. I think a lot of people are kind of getting aware of like, it's not sustainable for people to have opposite opinions on good and evil. Like that's a dangerous path.
Yeah, that's just weird. Yeah.
And so I think that philosophy is, I think this dialectical approach is kind of a mechanism for getting people on the same page. And religion is a way of getting people on the same page, but they're different approaches, right?
Mm-hmm.
Philosophy is kind of like persuading people to get on the same page. Religion is kind of like, I don't know, like jumping in, jump into the water, feet first.
Assuming we all know what it is that unifies us.
Yeah.
We
It's
just
an
know what it
assertion.
is.
It's an assertion, and we go along with it.
Yeah, maybe an emotional persuasion to get on the same page rather than a logical persuasion, perhaps.
Yeah.
And so I think that like our modern day and age is very epistemically complex, right? Like in ancient time, like if you're living in a tribe with a small number of people, maybe you can figure out your environment. I think modern people are not as equipped to deal with ever increasing complexity. And so having an epistemology is more and more important, right? You need to marry your ideology to an epistemology. And so that's why I hope that a project like this is successful.
Yeah, I do. I do too. I just don't know if this is the one. And part of it is he's got to stick it out there. And part of it is see if it's successful, or if not, back to the drawing board.
Explain that last bit again. Marrying your epistemology with your ideology.
So I guess you could say your ideology is like your value propositions, or maybe your worldview, like kind of your facts and values about the world. But like maybe your facts are wrong, maybe your values are wrong. You have to have a moral epistemology and and an ontological epistemology to get your is and your ought correct. You know what I mean?
Yeah. That's where I see the biggest gaps too. And just like you said, like things get turned upside down where two people can see the exact same thing, and one thinks it's the utmost evil and one thinks it's the utmost good. And that's where we're flipped and turned upside down. And where I agree with Vervaeke and with you, somebody's got to put us all on the same page, at least as far as those things go,
So I have a proposition for how to make this project work, or one of these philosophy project work.
I'm ready.
We need to bring back the principle of tithing.
All right, I was not expecting that.
10%.
Does he have a Patreon? Like maybe only
I actually am a Patreon, so
Oh, does he have a Patreon?
This is a good segue into that because I had it in my notes, but I wasn't sure if I was going to talk about it. But
if he has a Patreon, he'll take it. He'll take time to speak with you directly.
Well, they've changed that model a little bit.
Oh, really?
Yeah, just recently. So right before he launched this, he had like a special thing with his Patreons where we could go and ask him questions. And I asked him one. I basically said, I can't remember, like, are you gonna have critics on regularly to like, because my thing is if you aren't listening to your critics, then you're gonna go off the rails. And he answered in a fine way. I think he could sense I think he doesn't want to be a guru, and he recognizes that he basically is a guru, and so he's been really hesitant to even launch this project, and he was close to backing out according to what I learned in there.
Wow.
But he does not want to be a guru or a grifter. Like, he understands that he's been hurt too, and so it's like not what he wants to do. But at the same time, I don't see how if we're not coming around John Vervaeke, I guess he wants us to go around Socrates, right? Like, not me. Let's all focus on Socrates. Or, like, I don't know. So I found that interesting. And there's like that support paradox, kind of like what Seth was getting to. It's like you ask for money, then you're a grifter. If you don't ask for money, then you can't actually produce anything of value. Like, and then there's this like clickbait model of making money, and I really do think that we need to be like giving our money to either like journalists or people like John Vervaeke just because we trust them, and not because we're interested in what they're actually saying. You know what I mean? Like, especially journalists, like we need to pay journalists to do good work, not to give us what we want to hear. And right now the model is we click on the ones that tell us what we want to hear, and then they get paid the most. And we're not getting what we need. And I think that is kind of, I've thought of tithing. I was like, tithing you pay no matter what. And that would curb off some of the problems there, I guess. Anyways, those are thoughts.
But then it's like really becoming a religion, and he really is a guru.
Right. Like it's a total paradox, because you ask for money too much, you seem like a grifter or a guru. Like there's no way around it.
Like, in order for this type of a project to succeed, it has to transcend Vervaeke. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It has to become like an institution of and unto itself.
He does have a lot of ideas around that. He was talking about like different groups kind of starting up and then kind of verifying the group so that other people can know they're a trustworthy group, and there'd be some kind of board to decide how to decide that. And he's like, I know there's going to be flaws with this, but we have to have something. I've heard him talk about stuff like that.
Right.
And
franchise.
Yeah.
I don't know.
The one of the things about all this stuff is if you ever really read all the Plato stuff directly, you'll kind of realize that, oh my gosh, people extrapolated a whole lot from this, like a little bit like scripture, like there's one sentence there that turned into this whole field of philosophy or something, you know what I mean? And part of what's interesting to me is like, I can just like imagine, like, say it wasn't Plato, say it was Peterson who was there 2,500 years ago. And then all the ways people could have taken the different things Peterson said and taken that one idea and gone and made their one sect off that one little idea. And I think that's just part of the human.
Rule 6.
Yeah, it's just part of the human thing. Like, if this thing survives, just imagine like if Joseph Smith was reborn right now and came and looked at the Mormon Church. Like, what is this? And I don't think any institution would be that different after long periods of time. If it's successful, it just would mutate and change so much over time, and that's maybe part of one of the problems. But
this is certainly lacking community in its current form too, I think.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so Marti, you do try to bring people together, have dialogues with your 3 practices stuff. And
Yeah.
You're not just imagining, you're trying to do it.
I had a really cool conversation. I was messaging you about it with this one lady, and after we talked, she's a little bit fired up because I was questioning her, and I managed to just keep asking questions, and then I was using a lot of language that this is what I think, and I just don't believe that. And she backed down a little bit, and by the end of the conversation, she was like, I don't think we're disagreeing that much. And I agree with her. And I think that's a lot of the problem of like a lot of the divide stuff is we're defining things differently into our little tribal ways, and just misunderstanding.
Totally. That's what Wittgenstein, like if you go and look at Wittgenstein, his whole thing was, it's just language. We're just miscommunicating language. I brought up before the clip. I don't know if you remember, but we bring up this clip from Fargo, where the guy at the end of Fargo wanted to try to make symbols to make language make more sense to everybody. And Wittgenstein tried to do that too. And it ended up looking like, if you go and look at it, it looks like this big mathematical equation. But he was almost positive that if we could just make all these words make sense the right way to everybody, he's a little bit like anti-Derrida stuff, and actually did a really good job with it. It's just nobody can follow that mathematical language. Just think about this, it was in episode 3, so I don't think you saw it yet, Marti, but he talks about Gnosticism, and boy, oh boy, that word Gnosticism, like there's so many different versions of what Gnostic and Gnosticism means and doesn't mean, and all that sort of stuff. So it's like almost like impossible to talk about it without invoking all the millions of meanings of it. But like, yeah, when it comes down to like little grievances in day-to-day life, it's for sure seems like we're just missing each other a little bit. And not to give Derrida his credit, but I got to give it to him a little bit. But beyond that, it's not just that the words don't mean exactly the same thing to each other. It's like they're like Seth said, it's like a value thing. Like there's something just whiffing past each other a little bit. But
I know past this is kind of ties back into what I was saying about virtue earlier, because the point of that kind of virtue is that plants and animals don't need to use words to do all that kind of stuff, to go about the process and operate. And you learn that a lot more when you get to other pseudo philosophers like Terence McKenna and that kind of world. But it's also a very, very prominent feature of religions like Mormonism, because in the end, your experience to confirm your faith into a knowing, like the brother Jared, you know you don't have faith anymore because you know nothing doubting. It all happens without words. It's an experience. It's unspeakable. And that is also to Socrates' point. I know that I don't know anything. And leaves it at that, basically. You don't really have to say anymore. And that's the point. Words can't do it justice. And that's also one of the deeper points to Socrates, which I think Vervaeke slightly mentions, is there's always 3 ways to interpret Socrates, which honestly, if I'm being honest, there's 3 ways to interpret my first 2 books, because that's what Jordan Peterson's kind of been on about. You listen to Peterson and there's what he's talking about, and then there's 2 other ways to interpret it that he knows are there for people to find. To get to the end point of the top of the pyramid, that's not really a thing that's there at the one that's all of us. You know what I'm getting at now. That's the whole point. We don't need the words to get at any of that, which is maybe one thing John misses. And I could go into a whole lot of Zen things about that. I almost did earlier, but I decided not to.
Well, so the answer is more dialogue, but without words.
Yeah.
Oh, I feel bad. I kind of went off on a tangent. So
no, you didn't know.
Well, no, like, what did Chris hope to see, or any propositions of how to help this project succeed? Why do you hope
Chris?
to see it? Well, I guess it's Christopher. Seth went.
Yeah, it's Christopher.
No, well, I guess so. This is kind of the Zen stuff I was gonna say. I'm like a weird blend of optimistic and pessimistic about it. I don't care if this one or any of them succeed, because I know it doesn't matter if any of them do, really, in the end, large scale. And that's to the point of anything that Lao Tzu and Christ and Socrates are trying to tell you. And I think maybe, and it's hard to say, but one thing, and one of I guess the Zen approaches that I kind of live by, and I feel like, because you said, he doesn't want to be a guru, but he's put it out there this way, and that's kind of what he's becoming. And the way to avoid that, what Eastern philosophies, many of them teach you, is, and I don't know if I got this phrase from somewhere else or if it's one I boiled down myself, but it's essentially, there is no teacher until a student arrives. And you can take that so many other different ways. Like, you don't really need to go see a psychotherapist unless you think you need your head examined. You don't need to go confess your sins unless you think you've committed a sin that needs confessing. That's all the same idea. And sorry, my fibro brain, because I went off on a couple tangents. What was I getting at? The Zen.
What do you hope to see?
What I hope to see. There is no teacher until a student arrives. And maybe John has had some students say, hey, take this further, and he's presenting it. But that's also kind of the problem, because that phrase means to know that you don't know anything means that there is no teacher that you can really learn from until you think that you have found someone that you need to know something from, that they have something you don't. When the point is that no one does. And Alan Watts would talk about this, and I may have spoken to one of you two about it already. You learn in the end, like when you're young, your grandfather he's so wise. He knows so much. He can answer everything. Your dad's a little bit there too. And then the years go by and you become a grandpa, and you have all the answers too for kids coming to you. But you also sit there and you're like, on Wikipedia, like, I don't fucking you don't know, and that's the point. So
It's fun. I always had fun telling my little nephews and nieces obvious lies and them picking it out in 2 seconds. And but anyway, we're
My point is, I hope he just succeeds for Vervaeke's sake, not
yeah.
for all out philosophy, but you know, it's good knowledge for people to have if they're interested.
All right, so we're hitting the 2-hour mark, and I said we keep it at that. And this is my final question, maybe two-parter, but is this something people coming out of Mormonism, you say, hey, check that out? And is it worth us keeping looking at our time? Those two questions.
I'll go. It depends on the person, I'd say. I think there's a sliver of people that are interested in this. And then part 2 is, yeah, I enjoyed church. We should do it again. Good Sunday school.
Yeah. Seth?
Yeah. I feel like this lecture series is a little bit too academically heavy or terminologically heavy for the average person. Maybe the awakening from the meaning crisis, maybe that would be a better prerequisite. I'm not sure, but I know
it's almost worse as far as like
it's almost worse.
Well, I mean,
haven't
being
watched
like
it, so I don't
laden
know.
with. I think it's tougher than this. I think this one he was trying to reel it back, and I think you're right that it's still
Like-
heavy. Yeah.
I'm definitely going to watch it because I think it coincides with a lot of my interests. So for me, it's good.
Christopher,
Sorry, what were the questions?
is this something you would steer somebody like leaving Mormonism looking for something too? And do you think it's worthwhile for you to keep checking out?
Oh yeah, I mean, so it's kind of like Marty said, take the right person. I don't know anyone that I would send it to because it's very. I mean, when you leave Mormonism, you don't just want to be. One of the reliefs I had was, I don't have to hold on to all this knowledge anymore. I don't have to remember how to get through the temple and all that. Like, I wouldn't want to pack on all this Greek and Vervaeke nonsense. I wouldn't direct anyone there necessarily, but maybe the right person. And I mean, it's a pocket of the conversation, especially with who he's talking to more and more these days. It's just going to keep growing, and I think we need to have our voices out there on it.
Yeah, I like it. I'm interested in it for myself. I don't know who I'd recommend it to. You three are the only 3 that I was pretty sure would be able to get through it. And everybody else, I think Jared's he's the guy who comes on my channel. I think he's getting through it. But I can tell he's a little bit like, oh, okay, I'll check the next one and that sort of thing. And some of the other ones, it's like, no, I can't. And I think those guys are ones who might even lean to something that might like that. And so then I think of some other friends who just aren't even anywhere near this plane of thinking. And no, it just would not be something that would fly with them or help them out very much, and not help them out. I mean, it could help them out. They got into it. I'm saying they're not going to get into it, but I don't know. Maybe when it changes into some of the dialogues and stuff like that, maybe there'd be an episode or something that you could direct them to.
I'm definitely interested to see where it goes.
Yeah, for sure.
For sure. Oh, yeah.
Well, all righty. Thanks you guys so much for doing all that homework and getting all edified and coming to Sunday school and helping us. Should we end with a prayer or a meditation? Everybody put their trims down but
I just want to say, how refreshing is it to be able to critique the doctrine instead of just like swallowing wholesale?
Yeah. Yeah, that's true too. And the thing is I'm sure Vervaeke would be fine with it or even listen if he had time,
Yeah. Send it to him.
Yeah.
I'll send it to him when you publish it. He might.
I don't know that there's much to edit out, so it shouldn't take me long. So, all right.
Chris.
Thanks, you guys.
Yeah, it was fun.
Catch you.
See ya.
Catch you later.
Yep. Have a good night.